we're really excited to be doing this talk today with Linda Sormin and Clare Twomey. And they are two people that have been in conversation for a long time. So we met, I think, on Wednesday, and they were telling me that they've sort of been talking through some of these things since 2005. So I'm really excited to hear what they have to say, and they're going to sort of go through their work and talk a little bit about using clay as a material and working at large scale and on large scale projects. So we're really happy to be joined by Linda, who's up in Alfred, outside of Alfred, New York right now, and Claire, who's in London. And they've sort of organized like a bit of a casual slide talk and conversation. So yeah, thanks a lot, Linda and Claire. We're really excited about this, and I'll let you two take over.
Thanks, Gus. And thank you all for joining us. It's great to see lots of familiar faces, and it's wonderful to see you, Claire.
I just want to echo Linda in saying thanks to everyone in joining us. I think that Linda and I will talk for a while, and then we're going to show some images, and the images might be things that you know of our work already, but maybe some of the conversations will allow there to be more knowledge somehow. And Linda and I have been in conversation for, it's over 10 years, doing these small recordings of conversations and really being engaged with each other's practice. So we're hoping that the conversation we have today will build on that, because I think that our conversations are always building. So that's kind of what we're hoping. And so what I'm going to do, Linda, is it a good time to put some images up, and we'll start to discuss one of our first questions, which is, you know, our paths of making, and why clay? Why clay for us?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that, you know, we've had time to reflect on in the past weeks. And I think that one of the opportunities that I've been interested in has been the chance to work with a material that makes me feel and be able to access something that is unseemly or something that is not approved of. You know, there's always a sense of, you know, when I was raised to be, you know, pure and clean, and, you know, the chances to subvert that or to transgress on ideas of purity, of something just being absent of other substances or influences or context. So all that complexity can come into how we address this material. You know, when I open a bag of clay, there's that funky kind of underbelly smell. It's not a nice smell. So the chance to express the parts of human experience that are not nice is one of the things that draws me to this material.
And did you know that from the first moment of engaging with clay, or is this kind of slightly post-rationalized as we've moved further and further into our cultures of making? So that kind of first moment of engagement with clay, did you know all those rebellious things that you feel?
Well, when I first started working with clay, I started working at in ceramics at a time when things were going wrong in my life. So there was a sense of things being off and, you know, upturned, and you know, that kind of a drama queen image of like falling to the ground in grief, or, you know, that felt very real. So going to ground, like falling on the ground, that kind of knowing that that's where you go when things are difficult and things feel ungrounded. I think that it was kind of this visceral connection with it. So as I started working with it in like ceramic classes and just feeling that material, it just really put me in a place where I felt like I was going to ground or underground. So it was very bodily felt.
Yeah, I think what that's making me think about is how clay meets you. You know, we often talk about what we impose upon clay, but I think clay meets us. And for a lot of the people who hopefully are joining us today, you must have that kind of, that feeling that, you know, often it rejects us, but a lot of the time it meets us. And whether that is the thing you're talking about, where it helps us make sense to ourselves or help us make sense to the world outside of us, it's yeah, it meets us. This is kind of the best way I could kind of try to understand that in what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really curious to hear your perspective too. You know, your work is so much about how clay meets us in social and historical contexts, and physically too, through acts of labor, and how we engage with labor. Could you talk a bit about your encounters and how it meets you?
Yeah, I think that I think there are many materials in the world. We know this, just probably all of us, you and I, have this relationship with clay, and it's a very, very ongoing relationship. You know, when I went to art school and I worked with clay, then it made sense to me. The histories made sense to me, because our histories are of people and of this sharing of skill, and who handed what to whom. How did that become in so many ways? And I think that one of the first things I did when I was at art school, I made this, you know, in the day of no internet and all of those things, I made this tiny little sketchbook, you know, photocopying things in the library, and just made up my own little sketchbook of my own A to Z of clay, actually, because I didn't find any books that did it. And I was trying to figure out, but, you know, I don't think the book was so much full of clay. I think it was full of people and what they'd done with clay. And I think that's, you know, in a way, a lot of my introductions, and of course, you know, like you meet your heroes there, don't you? You meet the people you don't understand. And I suppose that in many ways, it's the chameleon of clay that I enjoy a great deal. So here in this big image, there's many pieces of clay, and they've been handled by many people, they've been designed by many people, and I gathered them in this form. And so in that way, there's other opportunities. So when I made this work at the Nelson Atkins, there was another way to greet people and another way to hold discussions. And this is fantastic to see Linda's got her cup. Yay. But that's, I mean, you know, like they're all over the world. They've gone to travel out. But I'm going to finish that little, hopefully, I'm hoping this little film might play.
Also, just as she's going through, like 10,000 people have ownership of these cups, and they signed agreements. So there's a relationship that you invited us into.
Yeah, and there were 10,000 pots in another piece of work, but in that one there were 1,345 cups, which anyway, so I suppose this is about the relationship of clay and how it performs. I think I'm really interested in how it moves, how it changes, how it performs. And so really those three images were to kind of show in a way, you know, how, I suppose, why clay continues for me, because I constantly feel like I'm just touching the surface with this material. Like it performs for us, we perform for it. It does things like, you know, here in this little film, it's unfired, it's activated and performing in another way. And I think for me, it's what draws me back, because all of those relationships are so deep within the human condition, of whether that, the thing you first just described there, Linda, of opening that bag and that smell. You know, what happens when we break things, what happens when we make things, what happens when these materials kind of perform in us endurance in some ways. So I think it's the, you know, why clay is that it's never two-dimensional.
No, and it totally resonates with me what you're saying about it being performative. You know, because it comes from a place that we go that is not only about seeing, not only viewed, it's not only visual, but it's also something that it's sensorial. It's what we touch, it's what we smell. It touches us in all of these embodied ways. And so the way we experience play or dreams or fantasies, you know, as kids, I went to a one-room school for a long time, so I really identify with all the homeschooled people out there right now, and the homeschooling parents. But my dad was my teacher during that time, and at recess we would either play outside, build forts, dig holes. You know, it was this very physical kind of engagement with the world. And then when the weather was bad, we would, you know, go inside and we would pile desks up and we would make landscapes and enact things with, you know, plasticine. And so this clay-like material, even though I was always playing the wild wolf, kind of howling from the top of a pile of desks, you know, this kind of area of the subconscious, I would always make these pinched bowls, and the wolf would have these pinched bowls from which to eat. You know, so somehow it made sense to create place. It's a kind of place-making device because it comes from place. It is place. And it has a sense to, it has its own agency. It pushes back on us when I was first learning to throw. I think that sense of things being out of control, things uncentered, and just that act of trying to get in sync with this material that was kinetic and this tool that was kinetic and pushing my body in ways that were unfamiliar. You know, it makes me sweat, it makes me work. And that engagement pushes me beyond what a lot of other materials demand of me. And that material demand takes me to a place of struggle, of precarity. This image is of Seth, my partner, who's also involved in a lot of labor that goes into making the works. My mom, Sue, and the family, you know, kind of support just throughout life to be able to do the creative things that we do. But this piece was something that was about, you know, that lack of ability to hold things together, perhaps emotionally. I was working on some conversations with my dad about his experiences in the Second World War. So the idea of, you know, how did that make you feel? And what my dad always says is, well, it gives me a strange feeling. And so, you know, how do we embody experiences like anger? I think that's something that, and fracturedness, you know, things like as cataclysmic as the World War and as the difficult events that people are facing now. You know, how do we hold things together? And I think that the material offers itself up to be metaphor, but also to embody those tensions and those feelings of threat and vulnerability.
And it's just something you just said there about not only encapsulating, but something about defining. There was in one of the interviews that we held during the large performative piece a couple of years ago at the Tate, this large factory, which we'll come on to later, but there was one of the skilled workers who'd been in the factory, as they say, man and boy, and he had this lovely expression, and he was talking about how quite a few apprentices would start with clay, not having maybe the same journey as a great deal of people have with clay. He came into this as an apprentice in a busy factory environment. I say a lot of apprentices didn't stay with it. We had this lovely expression that's really stayed with me that I think we all relate to. He was cutting the lip of a jug, 250 of those in the morning, and he said, well, you've got to have a feel for it. And I think for all of those things that you've just called to, there is that sense of you've got to have a feel for it. And actually hearing John say that 2 years ago helped me to recall of having a feel for it. There's something that's the thing that you started describing, that thing that's inside you that it calls to. And so when we start to look at this lovely piece that's on screen here and the incredible complexity of that, you know, like to describe every motion or movement would be really hard, and how each one of those motions and actions is tied to a story that is only tellable through this medium.
Yeah, when my dad first answered my question with that strange feeling, I kept pushing, you know, and that was, he just continued that refrain of the strange feeling. And so that calls for other physical manifestations. So that work was a response to that. And then the title's a little bit off the page, but this is a piece that I made this past year, Reshaping Rage. And the title's taken from Judith Butler's essay in The New Yorker, Reshaping Rage when revenge makes perfect sense, you know? So that sense, it kind of was building on what my dad was talking about and maybe feeling. And if you just forward through, you can just kind of get the sense of, like, in the making, it's not just her quote is so great. She said, "People in the world have every reason to be in a state of total rage. What we do with that rage together is important." And what kind of pulls the whole dialogue in ceramics for me together is that context of craft as well. So when you're talking about the worker who had that sense of the sense of it or the feel for it, it's grown through practice, a craft practice that is yearning towards and needing towards skill that fulfills that need in the human world. And so even when these are sculptures and not functional works, they call to that act of making a coil-built pot or using repetitive labor to create something, and then maybe unraveling some of that skill, but still holding moments of recognition of what it means to strive towards doing something well and to caring about something. And I think that's something that I think is so relevant in what we all are experiencing in the world, is that need for care.
And it's also this beautiful image of how incredibly layered. And, you know, I feel very lucky, Linda, to have seen your works, you know, in their growing as well as their finished state, and knowing the incredible amount of time, meditative, thoughtful, difficult time that goes into all of these arrangements. It's, I think we receive it as a huge amount of information, but all of the details, it must make these completely joyous to reflect on. I don't know if they're joyous to make. Are they joyous to make, Linda?
Not usually. Usually they start with a clot of feeling and that becomes physical tangles and clots. And it's not, they're not usually grown from a cheerful place, but I do feel that they celebrate kind of this full extension of human feeling and things that I'm not able to say. And I think that's what ceramics also does for us. It lets, you know, through our labor in getting to know the material and crafting an object or, you know, wrestling it into being, there's something meaningful about being someone who hopes for something, and the act of making being something that offers this dialogue that goes back and forth. And, you know, I really love what Judith Butler says about, you know, rage can be crafted. It's a sort of an art form of politics. It's like, how do we take those things that we feel are, or that as society says are not useful or not productive, but how can they be channeled or shaped into something? So that feels good to do sometimes, is, you know, to fully extend, to fully voice something, to hear the howl or to hear the thing that will be strong enough to propel us into change. And that, what you said about layeredness too, and how telling in your work too, I really love how things are durational. It's not something that you can just stop in and pop in on. Something happens over a period of time in your projects where communities are invited to share their voices and tell their stories. Can you talk a bit about duration and maybe what that leaves behind?
Yeah. I think in some ways the connector for me in this conversation is the sense of knowledge. You know, we're looking at a piece that was quite recently made, yeah? And in that way, I wanted to bring you to this moment. And interestingly enough, this was only recorded a couple of years ago. This is a spray booth in a factory, how plates are glazed in a factory. And when I first saw this, there wasn't iPhones. I think that even any recording device was quite big then. So I was really pleased to see this a couple of years ago and have a chance to record this, because for me, it represents a really early moment for me understanding the kind of joy of the diversity of clay. Like, what can it do? So I gone to art college and I'd seen lots of clay, lots of traditional clay, been introduced to the world of Volcus, understood that more things could happen. And then there was this thing that nobody was talking about, and I walked into the factory of Wedgwood and saw this. And for me, that was like wildly exciting, like Disneyland for clay. Like, how is this doing this, which is so different from all the other things that I've been told about? So in a way, I think that depth, and for a long time, that depth was just kind of tucked away. Like, it's like that scrapbook of things you carry with you. And a lot of the things that are present in your work is kind of visual archiving, Linda, in the way that things are stacked up and they're layered and they come forward, they go back. And in a way, that little kind of dancing, I think when I saw it, it was teacups. I showed you plates, so it was teacups. And I don't think I knew how or what to do with that, but it was one of those moments of something resonated. And so then later when I was making a work like this one, Consciousness Conscience, that again, it was the first point of engagement with industry that I'd undertaken. And I don't think those things this is definitely post-rationalization in terms of a collected history of how do you do what you do. Well, actually, what I was doing when I saw those dancing Wedgwood teacups was I was doing the job of learning craft, learning how to fire a kiln, knowing by looking at it what temperature it is, by wedging clay, by learning all the skills that we have at our disposal in many ways. And so I suppose that the reason I'm showing you these things is that eventually this blue came to play, to be at play in this work trophy. And so I don't think I rejected anything in the processes. And I think that really called to me when you spoke about opening that bag of clay. We all know that. And I'm really, really glad that I had the journey that I've had that has allowed me to now work in a really broad way with clay. Like, if there's a possibility that makes sense, I don't feel crowded in by what I should have done.
And just if this image and the image before, both, they bring all of that dialogue with skill and hands-on understanding, that haptic knowledge of how to make with this material and collaborate with it to do something that sites it within this history of, here the cast courts at the V&A, and just having people be able to touch and really breaking that boundary between who's looking at the art and where the art is. Now the things interact. And so you kind of, the work has broken through that screen. And so, and literally before, if you go back one image, that image, I always have this wonderful sensory charge when I, wish my own feet were kind of crunching through that porcelain, just like it would be crunching through that hard top layer of snow or something. There's such an environment that's transgressed on in both images. Things we take for granted, what we expect to be stable and unchanging, here in what we stand on, and in the next of how we behave in museums.
And for me, that recalls the time when we were working together at, well, we've had lots of times working together actually on sites, but the one where we worked, I think the closest was at Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, MIMA, and the kind of unraveling of the space that you undertook there, the language you have just given my work. I really recognize your voice in terms of the way that you traveled, or you invited people to travel through that space, which I'm sure there are lots of people who don't know this space. It's a very large gallery space. I think it's 15 meters by 10, very large, beautiful space. And Linda occupied it with a series of the most beautiful large scale sculptures of hers, as well as a broad walk that took you around, and an area that was a purposeful viewing point for destruction as well. It was really interesting.
What do you think it is about the behavior of people in spaces or in contexts that draws you back to do this? Like, I am also obviously very interested in it, but I'm curious about what personally, pulls you in and engages you and invites you to elicit that kind of behavior.
I think that the starting point is clay. I think there's this incredible commonality in this material, and it endears us. We know it. Nobody has more authority over clay than everybody in their homes. Everybody has a favorite cup, or they broke something, or somebody gave them something they didn't want, or they gave them something they loved, or, you know, there's this, you know, the material is king. It invites everybody to be part of it. And I think that for me, it's that invitation, that drawing together. It's what we see in great paintings, where people stand in front of a painting and they marvel at it. And the painting's amazing, but it's where they meet. It's what they understand together. If you stand in the Rothko room in any of our great museums over the world, there's probably more than one of them, but the one I'm thinking of is at the Tate Modern. If you stand there, you're not sharing that experience alone. You're sharing that with other people, and you've met and you've settled in that contemplative space. And it's what joins you and brings you together. And I think that painting enables that. I think that, you know, loads of different things do that. But I think clay does that as well, because of this commonality and where we meet. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that sense of wonder that you get in spaces like that. I mean, you can also get that outdoors, you can get that underwater, but that sense of wonder that we share in spaces that are problematic. Museums are problematic. There are power hierarchies that need to be decolonized and reshaped. And in that knowing that sense of agency of the viewer, of the person, the visitor in the museum, to act and to change things, to move things around, to take things home with them. You know, I think that's really, really charged and exciting.
But I think that maybe we'll talk about this like maybe in 10 minutes time. I know everyone's probably a bit drained from this being a longer period than we thought it would be. But I think in terms of that, then that's not an easy ask. It's not an easy ask of the Institute. It's not an easy ask of the public. Sometimes people will come to the works that probably you make and I make, who maybe aren't regular visitors to museums. And so there's this whole set of invitations that are problematic. And then the warmth of the invitation, or the difficulty of the invitation, are where it becomes difficult, or responsibility is for the person who's engaging. You know, if you take something, if we go back to the birds, if you take a bluebird from the V&A, then it is exciting and wonderful and all of those things, but at the same time, it's also a responsibility. And I think you made a work that had, look, this is brilliant. Linda's got the bluebirds as well. It's fantastic.
Just, you know, the way that the object, you know, engages us, and it has this, you know, so much about the work is the idea that the objects and humans have this relationship, you know, and they do. Like, you know, this is important to me. Of course, you made it. I care about it. It's traveled with me so far and for so long. But there's also a relationship to Wedgwood and to the idea that, you know, the clay holds a conversation with history, and these different, you know, shades of blue resonate in ways that people have treasured and held them close in cameos, things people wear. They adorn their bodies with them. They have them in their home, that intimate space. And because clay, like we were saying before, is from place, it is place, this idea of placemaking, you know, public spaces being transformed through creative means, that placemaking, I think, is something that we need to be redoing and reinventing and reshaping and opening up in more inclusive ways. And I think that because these objects are in our home, it includes a part of our lives that has that personal, it has a charge of a keepsake, an heirloom.
Yeah, and some of those things are wanted and they're not. You know, sometimes we keep objects that maybe are difficult to keep in some ways. But I think that's really what fascinates me, is that personal relationship that bonds us, but also allows a lot of space around us as well, in terms of whether you are displaying those things, whether you're keeping those in a box, but I think they're all about our human relationship, and how we give that voice in some way. But I'm looking at this huge sculpture you're working on here, Linda, on screen.
Well, we said we talk about scale, you know, and that's something that it's kind of the other end. If intimacy and holding something in your hand is meaningful to me, then also having something in this material that I know in one way and take for granted, maybe in one way, it explodes all of those presumptions and preconceptions that I would have when I let it go beyond the size of my body. And so I think that's one reason I'm interested in what happens when the clay body moves beyond my peripheral vision, when it fully extends its limbs, it's kind of, you know, ungainly, but also its limbs at risk, you know. So something this big, I wasn't sure when I was making it in the kiln whether it would dry and stay together. So I'm you know, rigging things up. I'm putting sand and grog and newspaper under it so that it will shrink and slides. All these things that I learned in craft making, and the communities that have taught me that, you know, are part of the making of this. So all of the voices in the head that say, this is how it's supposed to stay together, that's helping me do things that I'm not sure should be done or can hold together. So that idea that that things don't hold together in reality all the time, that things are at risk of falling apart, that things are unsteady and uncertain. We all know that. We know that now. We knew that before. And so that sense of putting something through a firing process, putting a body of material through trauma and heat and wondering if it will stay together, giving it a chance to respond and move in its own way, or disconnect if it wants to as well. I think that's part of the working in clay adventure for me in the hands-on studio-based research.
But it's an incredible willingness, isn't it? It's an incredible willingness to work with material in this way, in the continued way of working. So it's not like you've mastered many things, but you've mastered one thing and then you're repeating it. It's continually evolving in the works you make. And that onward dialogue is, you know, it's heroic.
I don't know if it's that. I definitely don't feel that. I'm like usually just kind of like miserable and people are walking by and I feel self-conscious. There's a performative, like a performative thing that happens when you work that big because you can't hide yourself in a public space. So this is happening in the kiln rooms at Alfred. And so I have friends and colleagues walking by and everyone has their 2 cents and you're just like, I don't know if this is going to work. And you just want to be, you know, in your basement doing it, but you can't fit this in your basement. So that idea of being laid bare, your process being bare and open and unmediated is part of I think part of the way that this object tells its story and the way that the process opens up this kind of absurd, you know, possibility of looking like a fool. So I think there's a kind of a bit of embarrassment sometimes that comes with ambition, you know, and I think that ricocheting between shame and the exhilaration of trying something that you haven't tried before, I think that's part of being human and trying new things. It's a kind of a blushy kind of.
I think that I'm laughing because I recognize that, and in a way, anybody who knows me on this call will have heard me say this, but one third of the way through, it's a nightmare. You've made the most terrible mistake. You don't know if anyone's ever going to believe that this was a very good idea. 1/3 through is always the most difficult and exposing moment. And, you know, I still have to remind myself of that, you know, 1/3 through. That's why I'm doubting everything, because it's those moments of working in public spaces, which I think is really useful to talk about in terms of the, as much as the clay skills that we learn and we hold and we reflect back on, these experiences of, if you speak to a choreographer or of a dancer, those experiences, those spatial experiences, those 1/3 of the way through endurances, they remain with you as a skill if you recognize them. It's never luck. It's taking those things forward. Like hanging a beautiful, great big piece of work like this. It's terrifying to look at, Linda.
Well, this is the sense of, you know, that because I built it in one orientation, I kind of knew this was the top, this was the bottom. But in installation, it's such an opportunity to literally unground things and upend things. So what happens when we see the underbelly of the piece and what was top becomes the bottom? So that inversion of where things were, where my ego led process, you know, that maybe is shown in the previous image, you know, where does that go when you are no longer in control of what it looks like from other perspectives? And, you know, that really, you know, surprise that I get when things are upturned. And John Roshman talks about that in his book on architecture, you know, that sense of the need to unground things. Frank Gehry's architecture does that. You know, how do you reinvent a shape or something that's supposed to be inside goes outside, and a kind of material like corrugated metal on the outside goes inside. What happens when we change the placement, not just where we are, but how we place things? And I think that's something that, you know, I do a lot of when I move, for example. I'm quite nomadic, so that sense of, you know, how does place changing shape the conversation and shape what I'm able to imagine, and then what am I missing out on? There's a sense of longing and loss too when you think of ungrounding. That really just says so much about what it means to be rooted, and a longing to be rooted.
It also so much talks about the continual dialogue in your work, you know, this ongoing ability to ask those big questions. What happens when we turn it upside down? What happens if it's seen in a way I didn't see it? So I think that it's quite interesting that in a way there's a lot of shared space there about placing things in the public and allowing those to be digested by yourself and by others. I think that's a large part of the practice.
I like how you're talking about including, you know, voices and including, you know, conversations in the work. So can you talk a bit about how your works invite people's voices? Like, we're both, you know, talking with people because we take so long to do these works. You know, how do we introduce and make, you know, platforms for the voices and stories of others?
Okay, so the reason I was whizzing through your beautiful pictures, which we're going to whiz back to, is because I wanted to find a kind of a good example of that, of where we meet people. And I got a feeling for that answer, we're not seeing these images in the right order, but I think it's a connecting thread through the work that here in this film, you can see that on this project, The Factory, that we had a huge workforce who started the factory, and then the public joined us in that. And they joined us within a very specific small task to be able to slip cast things or to make flowers. And in a way, it's the joining of those moments which are really interesting, not asking people to necessarily finish a thing or become a craftsperson, but for a moment they're included in a shared dialogue. And this is such a great example. There's a little film here. Yeah, the film's working, of this. And I think in many ways, Time Present, Time Past, which is the title of this work, is about, you know, you can see this tile panel that's being painted here. It's being painted gold. It's a beautiful William Morris wallpaper sketch that we made into a tile panel, very large. But it's the communication here where Flor, who is our master painter, is working with a member of the public. And that member of the public signed up to say they would be an apprentice for one day to learn from Flora how to gold paint and to help to complete this work. And what I'm saying is that sometimes it's not about scale, sometimes it's about intention. And the intention of this work is to have that depth of conversation. And nothing remains of this artwork apart from those conversations. So there isn't a great big gold tile panel. Some people have individual tiles. We worked with the Art Fund to make that possible for this project. But really the thing that's holding this together is the way that you can see in the images that Flora is looking at the person learning to paint, and then the person is looking at Flora for encouragement. And there's this interaction that happened at the Tate, it happens here, and here, which is a project which was an exchange of ideas of humanity, what it takes to be humane. So this little spoon here says, if humanity is in our hands, it needs equality. And in this work, it was asking the public for their thoughts of what it is to be humane, and then a year later, returning those with the spoon as a gift about, these are the words we collected about what it is to be humane. And there's another example coming further up. So that place of creating these exchanges is where people see themselves more clearly in a moment in some of the things that, you know, I definitely have paintings, and I go back to painting a great deal in terms of my rationale is I see paintings, and the reason I love them is they understand me. They see, you know, when I look at the Philip Guston paintings, one of my favorite painters, and I look at the paintings, or I'm looking at Rothko, they understand me. Or maybe I understand myself and them. But I think there are these moments which become more articulated when we use objects as the catalyst, when we draw people into dialogues. It's that, but extended and made more physical, I suppose.
Absolutely. I love that object as catalyst. You know, that relates to so much of why we make things. You know, it's so inconvenient to make things. Like, I wish so often that that there was something lighter in the world that I do, but I do engage with the thing as well. And I think it's because it does open up, just like this object, you know, not only is someone seeing it and thinking about it, and they made it and they're reading it, and so they're processing it, you know, cognitively, but also it goes into their bodies, you know, like that spoon enters your mouth. So that sense of physical experience of the piece is really deep in that. And these, I guess, these are also catalysts in some way of objects that relate to ritual objects that I've been visiting. When my family and I go to Bangkok, where I was born, my brother and I were born in Bangkok, and we visit the temples, the Wats there, and we, you know, are part of these rituals that are, you know, adding gold leaf or dropping coins into bowls, you know, one bowl at a time, and you hear the tinkle of coins. And whether the coin dropping into the bowl does something or not out in the world, I'm not sure, but it definitely does something in my sensibility. You know, my nephew and I are going along and dropping them in, and something about that embodying ritual, something that's been done for generations, something that's been done with hopefulness, that delicacy and that hand touch, the idea of gold leaf being a way that you commemorate something or honor something. This is a really small piece. It's just like a little one like this. Prajna Paramita, and that's the name of like the mother goddess in Buddhist, the mother of all Buddhas, and the goddess of what, perfect wisdom. So the idea that there could be this perfection in wisdom, but so much of that is about processing and accepting the chaos and the debris that is everyday life. You know, so the temples are crowded places. There's bits of gold leaf, yes, but ornamentation and the high level of intricacy and detail, also in the William Morris image that you were working with, you know, that idea of decoration being something that holds the articulate and highly invested in values that come through that kind of making. It's not just a one-off, it's not just one gesture, it's something that happens, although I like one gesture things as well, that full, you know, flow of things, but something happens at this small scale with small lines and cuts and textures and another kind of layeredness and delicacy and intricacy. I think intricacy holds something that also speaks to the complexity we were talking about before. So for the first time, I'm kind of just, you know, putting together bits of sketchbooks, old sketchbooks I've cut up and dipped in resin and introduced as another kind of line and another kind of drawing. I started out as a painting emphasis. So that idea of painting being, you know, part of these. So the back edge of that is all painted paper, watercolors, and bringing that together with material that is much more archival. It's going to last forever. That ceramic artifact will be there and it will last. It's a way that our generations, different cultures tell stories through ceramics, and paper is just so ephemeral. So the idea of paper and gold leaf being the lightest, but kind of a light-handed way of entering this range of ideas.
And tell me, it's quite interesting because, you know, we're going to next jump to you making this huge piece, I think out in Alfred somewhere, and to see this scale. I wonder, when you were talking earlier about the process of making and where that takes you and how difficult it is, how exposing that is, it's really interesting here because this looks like it's been sung with a different voice. Does that make sense?
It's definitely a different register. Yeah, it's another part of my sensibility, maybe more vulnerable, more like, often when I'm doing the other kind of work, it's not wristy at all. It's full bodied. This is like, I have wrists and I'm using them here in ways that I don't usually. So the idea that the pinching becomes this repetitive motion and that the wrist is involved in a way that is nuanced and at a scale that is, you know, there's a teacup in there. So the wrist is used in the activation of that object, the way that renderings, cross-hatching and tiny things happen in those ways. Also the X-Acto knife that I'm cutting things out with, or the tiny scissors. There's something about labor, and in many ways traditional women's labor that happens, you know, embroidery, crossed stitching, a lot of my students now. Yeah, go ahead.
Crafting.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So that sense of, you know, things happening in that scale is a different kind of placemaking. It's a domestic kind of placemaking, but all of these are around the theme of some kind of protectiveness and safety. So the one that was called Merjojong a couple of slides back, it's named for Merjojong, which is, it's this one. On the top of Batak Indonesian houses, they have silhouetted animals often, and spirit animals are often silhouetted up there. So just the sensibility of that, there's like an eagle in there, but these are all for protection. They invite the spirits of the ancestors to protect. And that's become really interesting to me as I kind of visit Indonesia and Thailand and visit where my ancestors lived and engaged in the world in their really particular ways at a time of, you know, really ugly colonialism and ways that people lost culture because of those bad things that happened. And so the wishfulness of having protective wishes for each other, you know, like, so if we keep going forward, the one that says, pass safely through redolent woods. So that is also just, you know, another kind of reflection on if you can pass safely through these forests, through these places that are inhabited, if you have the good spirits with you, then that all kind of ties into this wishfulness of small gestures, personal gestures, and things that happen within families and tribes. So I'm you know, from the Batak tribe in Indonesia. So all of those kinds of lost knowledges, I'm kind of groping through material and research and trying to connect with those voices of the people who came before me.
And I think, in a way, Linda, if we were sat in my living room or in a cafe in Denmark, we'd probably say at this point that maybe the kind of idea that you're making and continuing making, and we're thinking into the future, but we do that with the knowledge of the things we've already made, or what has been possible, or what that tells us. It's extraordinary to see this new work, and it's really, and your description of it, it's really an incredible body of new work. It reveals more, and I've kind of watched your work for a really long time, so it's really exciting. But maybe this is a good point to hand back over to Gus. Is that okay, Linda?
Sounds good. That sounds great. And thank you for those thoughts. It's so new. I still feel vulnerable, but it's great to share it with you.
Yeah, this was really great. Thank you both for keeping it cool and keeping us going. I feel a lot better after watching this, better about people. But I wonder if just really briefly, you two could talk about what I would imagine are like sort of the big differences in the ways that you two work, which is, I'm guessing, Claire, that you work much more project-based, and Linda, from like having you as a professor, I felt like I sort of saw you kind of constantly working sort of like bit by bit and accumulating work through that way. Have you two ever like really talked too much about how those different ways of working influence what you do?
If it's okay for me to chip in, Linda, is that okay?
Sure. Yes, go ahead.
I think we've reflected on them, Gus, in many of the conversations, and a lot of the time we talk about the context of making, which is really what you've asked, but in a way, I probably feel as much as Linda has just explored with this new work, that I don't think there's a set way of working, and I think that whenever I've made a thing, big or small, public, or then those things come with the project, but they come from me. And I think that in the studio, I'm continually investing in those through drawing and photography and where you go, what you do. And so I think that a lot of the work I do refer to as projects, but that's because a lot of the work I make doesn't perform in the studio. The scale is not possible, you know. I don't know. What do you think about that, Linda?
It's true. We do focus a lot on the similar ways that we engage communities and museum contexts. But when I think about the differences, I really admire how, you know, there is a clarity in idea when you begin your work, and but then it leads to these really open invitations to how people can influence then what happens throughout that, you know. So they know they're going to be doing this activity, but we don't know how that will gain momentum, like this making slip cast objects together over and over at that scale. What does that mean until the thing? So I like how that is open and grows, but it starts with this kind of clarity, and that's really beautiful. I think that way to calibrate social and institutional frameworks, Claire is brilliant, you know, and able to really kind of, the nuances of dealing with those kinds of hierarchies is very, very difficult. It's not an easy task. And I tend to grope a lot more, I think. Is that fair to say? And it's a bit more, like Gus is saying, I do a little bit here and I'm like, I'm not sure that's going to work. Oh, that's going to fail. Okay, and so there's this kind of, this way that I do one piece and another piece. Part of it's out of just not being sure what is happening and not knowing how to word it. And the only way that becomes articulated is for me to make it. And when I see it in series, so if I can see 8 of them, all right, I kind of start knowing what's happening. So I think we have, you know, very conceptually rooted values, and the ways that we work is resonant with each other in that way. And I really, you know, that's why I really like seeing the work together, the chances that we've had to work together. The difference is it's a relief to be in someone else's headspace and enjoy that surge of conceptual energy that takes shape and form and gets made in such completely different ways.
Yeah.
You know, my paws are all over this. It's like, wow. It's very, And that's not the aesthetic that comes forth in Claire's work. And I find that a really exciting contrast.
Someone wrote in and asked to see Linda's last 3 slides. I don't know if those were the last 2 that we went over. Yeah.
Is it going back or is it going forwards? Oh, let's go forwards, shall we? So.
Yeah.
That was just part of the process. So, you know, since we were talking about material, why we choose the material, I mean, part of it, and the craft thing comes from it being, you know, riffs off coil building. So we've been taught to coil build in a certain way, but what happens if that pot starts to unravel and starts to take on its own misbehaviors? So I'm interested in how can material misbehave? And so that turns into the next piece, which is, it looks quiet and composed on a pedestal, but in the making, it's this unruly thing. And if you, like Claire mentioned, you know, seeing a work in person and experiencing it spatially, and then having, you know, that flattened on a screen is very different, but it's the same work. And then that was the piece in the background.
Wow, it's amazing to see those, Linda.
These are, yeah, oh, that's a beautiful image. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's good. Well, this was the last slide that I'd put in, and is Medals for the Future, and it was made, you know, just 2 years ago, 18 months ago, and it feels very relevant at this moment, Medals for the Future. And a lot of the people who put forward their thoughts for this were saying that they came from a military base. This was made for a place of remembrance in the UK, and I'd been given the very small task of closing the 4 years remembrance for the Second World War. So that was like, so in a military context, then we made Medals for the Future. And it was very interesting that all of the people who'd been in the fields, who had post-traumatic stress syndrome, and, you know, they weren't talking themselves. They were saying that medals will be given to our medical carers and to nurses and doctors and people who help the infrastructure. So it kind of felt like that was a useful slide to put in at this very moment in time.
We have some questions that I just don't think we're going to get time to, so hopefully we'll be able to do another one of these in the future. If you two are up for it, I feel really lucky that you two were up to do this. This was such a great thing, and thank you so much for sharing it with us and for getting through the disruptions and keeping us all sane.
Thanks, Gus. Thanks for having us. Always good to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thanks to BKLYN Clay for putting this all together. You're doing such an amazing spectrum of things. Like, totally hats off to you, and thanks. It's a real privilege to talk to Linda and meet you guys.
Thanks for sticking with us, and hope to see you on in person soon.
Thank you very much.